in as far as uncertainties go, there is one realm of economics, or should I say global finance, where uncertainty seems to be the order of the day. And that would be the crypto market. Cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and all the rest of them seem to be the next big thing. For the last couple of years, that is what a lot of investors and finance people have been talking about. And, people have been advertising the prospect of investing and buying Bitcoin and so forth. And so it became the next hot commodity. A few people were concerned about its volatility and its reliability, but that didn't stop investors and speculators. And a lot of people within the last few years have made a lot of money trading on the various, exchanges for cryptocurrencies. Except now, as if to confirm the fears that were initially raised by the skeptics, we saw what happened with FTX over the course of the week. Now, in case you don't know what FTX is, I'm happy to be joined today by finance consultant Wotsomu Wanda, who is going to tell us, first of all, what the cryptocurrencies are all about, how cryptocurrency markets and exchanges work, and what we are to make of the recent controversy surrounding the troubles that have befallen FTX. So, welcome once again to the FATBOY Show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here again. And this time, of course, we went to cryptocurrencies. Very fascinating area to be thinking about.
I've always noticed that you have expressed skepticism. And in following you on Facebook over the years, I would just keep seeing you prodding and poking and mocking the whole idea of cryptocurrencies. Even when things were good.
When they are very good.
Even when they were good for the investors, you were still expressing your doubts. So explain to us what cryptocurrency is and why it is not something you are fully on board with.
Yeah, cryptocurrencies are basically a form of currency. This is digital. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not physical.
Right.
And they are based on a particular technology that came into being because of particular events that had occurred earlier. The technology itself, the backup technology of cryptocurrencies is blockchain. Mm-hmm. Now, blockchain technologies have been around since the 80s, and people have been fidgeting around with them, coding and improving and doing a lot of work with them. Mm-hmm. One thing that they often notice that the technology itself could be useful for a lot of different applications going forward. That is, if it was to be improved, if it had better platforms, and especially if there were better communication systems around the world, then blockchain is very promising for the future.
Yes, I think for me, what was attractive for me was the fact that they appeared to be, at least on the surface, a form of decentralization, kind of power reverting back to the people, away from the control of the central banks that have wrecked economies throughout history. Now, the power of money and transfer of money and wealth creation is in the hands of people. There have been many restrictions that have been put in place that would restrict certain individuals from being able to access or to transfer money. And when you see what's happening now with sanctions, like let's say Russia, where either Russian individuals or entities or the government itself can't easily move its money around, cryptocurrency seems like a solution to the problem of the centralization of the financial control of the global economy. To where anyone can just turn on and turn off the switch at will, and usually the switch will be wielded by the powerful. But now with cryptocurrency, it just seemed like the common man and the common woman was now empowered. Now, was that all just hype in your opinion?
Not necessarily. As the definition of blockchain itself is decentralized systems.
Yes.
So it's a ledger system that is decentralized and not controlled by any particular institution. Mm-hmm. That was the basic definition of blockchain and the promise that you've just talked about.
Right.
Which was very good. Now, given what had gone on, especially after the collapse of the international economy, when we had the Great Recession, and what happened with Lehman Brothers.
Right, this is 2008.
That's 2008.
Right.
By October, there came Satoshi Nakamoto, who wrote a white paper on Bitcoin.
Okay.
Now, the Bitcoin currency, or the particular idea, was to ride on the blockchain technology. And so it was a promise that a currency of some sort that promised to work and it was not centralized or did not necessarily have to go through a centralized system was differentiated. In other words, as you said, it was distributed around the world and could be controlled from either corner of the world without any particular individualized, centralized institutional control, would be a promising idea to be a peer-to-peer payment system without necessarily any control. That kind of held promise on its own. That is, if you have the technology and you have the widespread particular ways of allowing it to function to the smallest person around the world.
Okay, well, from the time it became a thing and in the few years that followed, we saw a rapid increase in the value of Bitcoin. And those who had invested early, who had ignored the skeptics and bought in early, were able to cash out with the Bitcoin at what, 40,000?
Yeah, it went all the way to 60 or thereabouts.
Wow, at its peak.
At its peak.
Okay.
And it started at zero.
And it started
yes, the initial transaction was less than $1 each.
Imagine.
The initial transaction.
So a lot of people made out good and at least in the early stages.
Yeah, and I think that's where the problem does arise. As a technology, it really offers promise. And as a currency, it needs to be widespread. But the idea, to make it kind of functional, or it was to limit its supply as far as Satoshi Nakamoto was concerned. Basically, this was an idea that was kind of creating a new gold standard, but this time digitalized. In other words, you'd have a system of currency that was controlled and it was not fiat, that it could generate and create a flood of currency like they've done basically with the dollars and the rest of the international currencies we have around, where there's unlimited supply. Like there is no limit to what central banks can generate, of course, other than inflation down the line. But with gold, there was always a limited supply of gold. And so the idea was to create a digital version with a limited supply. So from the initial point of design of the idea, the algorithm was to allow 21 million Bitcoins. That's it. Nothing more. Yes, nothing. I think from that period up to today, around 19 million have been generated, mined.
Okay.
Of course, this is all algorithms and they
it's all very confusing. Yeah.
Exactly. If you go into that arcane detail, it's quite involving, and so it could generate a little problems. But bottom line is there are 21 million designed to be generated. Around 19.2 or thereabouts million have been generated, and only about 1.8 to go. That's the whole idea of Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin being a limited supply, the idea was that it would control inflation, it would spread around the world, and it wouldn't allow any individual control. The problem is, given this particular control and the idea that it was limited, real big players could come in and hold a chunk of it.
Yes.
From the word go, I think many were willing to hold and generate a particular chunk that they could hold on their own. Now, as it rose in value, instead of being a payment system as it was initially designed, it has morphed into more of an asset to hold and not utilize for transactions.
So what you then saw was a flood of hedge funds entering the picture.
Yes,
including it as part of a portfolio.
As portfolio holdings. And if any of them holds in billions or millions of it, rather than they hold the whole trunk share of it. And so the idea that it will be well utilized for transactions like we do with the ordinary currencies becomes a little bit problematic.
Yeah, I always found the problem to be the point of termination because, at some point you're going to want to buy goods and services.
Yes.
But the problem is, so are the retailers and the wholesalers willing to accept Bitcoin as a form of payment, or do you still have to convert it to, let's say, $1 or whatever the currency before you can buy? I always found that aspect of it to be quite interesting. So when it comes to cryptocurrencies, I know that it is not just Bitcoin. There are so many other varieties, Ethereum, Dogecoin. What is all this?
We started listing, we will go on forever. They are numerous. They are pouring out as fast as there are people willing to.
So can anyone in their bathroom just create their own?
They're basically doing that. I think almost every exchange around the world has its own coin. You would call it a coin or token that they utilize, which is more or less a currency, to play within their own system. So with exchanges, of course, they trade Bitcoins, they will trade Ethereum, they will trade, and then they will mix up with their own to utilize on their exchanges, and so hold those particular a combination of coins, and so there are so many. The proliferation is just overwhelming.
All right. So then, therefore, now we have all these cryptocurrency exchanges, and FTX being one of them, and one that has been making news.
Yes,
Apparently, their problems are significant given the amount of money they had received from their investors.
Yes.
And with many of them, once smelling a hint of danger, attempted to withdraw all their holdings and investments. But then they realized that the company didn't have the money anymore. Or am I misunderstanding it?
Can you getting it right.
Paint me the accurate picture of what happened with FTX.
Yeah, I think to get to FTX, it's best to finalize the curve of the Bitcoin story.
Okay.
Because from the time generated as a currency and being good money, all the values of good money are particularly noted and should be understood. One, general acceptance in the whole world economy. Two is the convertibility. Or three, the ability to store value.
Right.
And holding value. So the problem with Bitcoin has been the variations that it has. One time it will rise to high levels, then drop so drastically that if you're pricing an item in a Bitcoin, you'll be you'll have real problems holding on to your item and knowing what value to give it in Bitcoin, for that matter. So it loses this particular role as a currency because of the instability with which it's being functioning. Then it becomes more as an interesting item to hold because of the gains in value it can generate for any individual holding it. So the idea that it can rise in value to that extent with a particular demand within the market, of course, speculators pouring in, transited it from being a currency to more of an asset. And that's when it becomes more of a gold asset and a holding. But an asset with no particular use other than its gaining of value. So it was of interest across the markets because of the fact that it gains a lot of value. Anyone having it in their portfolio is bound to gain if they sell at the right time. But again, holding on for a period of time ultimately leads to it collapsing. And so they always lose in the end. Those who hold on for long always suffer. Ultimately, those who are with the bigger pockets and have a little side play that they can put in Bitcoin gain the most because they are willing to lose.
So how is it that these exchanges, FTX as an example, were willing or able to attract as much as they did in investments and allay the fears and concerns of the investors as to the potential havoc that might be wreaked in the markets? How are they able to convince their investors that their investments were going to be safe?
Now, remember, Bitcoin is designed not to be institutionalized, not to be centralized in any way. Ultimately, exchanges now come into play because of the fact that it's a good speculative item. Now, that being the case, many of them would be willing to trade it, and the more of them that proliferated trading Bitcoin and plus other coins for that matter, it now starts going through institutional kind of formations rather than initially that it was supposed to be decentralized, basically uniquely to the small man across the world. It was now more centralized within institutions and traded as such.
Okay.
Now, that being the case, because of the institutional appearance of exchanges, a lot of other institutional players within the financial system are now more willing to come in and now can trade and hold, knowing that they would trace prices, they would be able to play with institution to institution for that matter.
Right.
So for that matter, FTX would be working with Morgan Stanley for that matter. They would understand each other because as an institution to an institution, all of a sudden, the idea of decentralization starts receding, and now a speculative item basically comes into play. Now, that being the case, we find that the institutional players gain a lot by bidding it up for that matter.
Okay.
As long as you're holding, say, $1 million worth of Bitcoin, and you can create an atmosphere in which they are able to raise the value to double, triple, or even 4, 5, 10 times. Wonderful. And then you can see, the more you generate that activity, you're able to generate a lot of resources, you sell, and then when it collapses, you buy again at the low end and start now playing the game.
Over and over again.
back and forth.
Okay,
back and forth.
so what happened this time? Did they get ahead of themselves and simply were not able to withstand the onslaught of the collapse?
Yeah. Now FTX, for that matter, has particular branches. It has the international arm and then the U.S. arm. The U.S. arm was a little bit registration, and the process of getting one up and running in the U.S. is a bit more controlled. But its international arm, which is much bigger and controlled 98% or more of its business, was a little bit...
They were headquartered in the Bahamas.
Even if, but it was a little bit more wild in its play. And one of the things they discover along the way, that this particular individual, Sam Bankman-Fried,
a 28 or 29-year-old?
No, he's now 30, 32 in that range.
Okay.
Yeah. He owned a hedge fund, Alameda Research, in which he started shifting a lot of resources from FTX to this hedge fund, and then the hedge fund could play within the cryptocurrency market wildly.
Just a minute, but that almost sounds like a conflict of interest, where you are using your investors' money to finance your own activities with your hedge fund.
Exactly. That's what was going on.
And how was he able to do this without anyone noticing?
Now, what they're discovering is that he had, within FTX bookkeeping process, generated a window that he alone and a few individuals were aware that the shifting of resources from the company, from the exchange to Alameda Research. It seems no control systems were able to trace or notice or be aware of what was going on. So this was a secret backdoor created in his books, and he was able to transfer resources without any awareness across the board. Now, that being the case, playing with Alameda, and I think they were pretty wild in their play and testing out different limits, they kept losing money, and it collapsed.
But just a minute. But before the collapse, I remember there were front page, like he was on magazine covers, Forbes magazine.
Oh, yeah.
The youngest new hot billionaire.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was rivaling many of the big players, and he was yet another wonder kid born of the internet that everyone was marveling at. So it seemed like everyone thought of him as a genius. But perhaps, as it is the case with a lot of geniuses, is that they don't always... they're not always the most transparent people. They hold their cards close to their chest, and sometimes they may be up to no good, like in this case.
Yeah, that's very true. And he almost, since he was best within the U.S. system, he was the face of the cryptocurrency. A lot of others are all around the world. Men are in Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and for that matter. But he was in the Bahamas and Washington, and then he would be in Chicago, around. So he was in the U.S. and did a lot of face-to-face interaction with regulators, for that matter. And I think one of his board members, the chairman probably, was a former FCC chair.
Oh.
A regulatory guy who had come on board.
Wow.
And he was on many occasions meeting with Congress and giving, of course, lectures.
I think I saw an appearance of that young man in one congressional hearing.
Exactly. He had congressional hearings he was paying. So he started becoming the face of cryptocurrencies, and he started becoming more of an institutional individual whom everyone looked at as the face of the industry. That
only added to his credibility and made it easier for him to get more investors.
In fact, they're calling him the philosopher king of the sector, for that matter. While at the same time, he had generated a hole within his trading arm, his exchange, and he was chiffoning out a lot of resources to the Alameda Research, a hedge fund that was now investing in different areas and testing out limits, for that matter, and then ultimately it collapsed. It's only the collapse of Alameda that woke up a great deal of people, because during the process of realizing there was a problem with Alameda, I think Reuters wrote a story, and in it there was an indication that Alameda held a lot of FTT. FTT was the now coin that FTX utilized on its exchange. So a part of its asset holdings was a great deal of FTT. And since it was collapsing, they realized, wait a second, if they're holding this much FTT
and are collapsing,
what does that tell us about the FTT within the exchange itself?
Okay.
Will there be a problem since both these companies are owned by the same individual? Though he had indicated earlier that no, there's a huge wall between the two companies. There's no way they relate, and different boards for that matter and everything. But that particular detail that there was a lot of, in part of its asset holdings, FTTs were a lot, and a great deal of it. And so there was a problem with the valuation of FTT, which would affect the valuation of the exchange itself, since its basic asset was the FTT that they sell to their customers for that matter. And you know that, so the individual, what was interesting is that his rival and friend for that matter of Binance, which is the biggest exchange in the crypto market, who was initially a shareholder within his own exchange, had been bought out, and he created his own, which then went on to become the biggest for that matter. Now, he then indicates, wait a second, in the process of me being bought out of FTX, part of I was given FTTs to the value of 500 million as part of the buyout.
Right.
And I'm holding those. Are they holding any value?
Okay.
Have they all collapsed? So he was on Twitter and immediately tweeted out that he's selling everything.
And that launched the bank run, as they call it.
Exactly.
Everyone wanted to cash out.
By then, everyone now knew. Now he knew he could know something. Alameda has collapsed. The other big holder of the FTT is also threatening to sell everything. There is a problem with FTTs within the exchange. So all people holding FTTs who are putting their dollars and the other and holding FTTs immediately rush to exit. 6 billion is withdrawn within, I think, 24 hours. And then the whole exchange runs out of liquidity. And for that matter, what was interesting that initially there was a fight on Twitter. You know these fights
it's so funny. Right? And yeah, it's all going down on Twitter.
Fascinating following, when two big people go against each other and everyone knew they're friends, they have known each other.
Exactly.
So when they're tweeting back and forth and you're basically indicating, well, you go for your friend, you can't ruin the whole ecosystem and things of that nature. Ultimately, there was a tweet that comes through that Binance is buying FTX.
Yes, I saw that. I saw that. But
exactly,
it didn't go through.
It didn't go through because they indicated through due diligence they'll find out whether it's worth acquiring, then merge the two, if possible.
Okay.
So in due diligence, they find FTT's books well.
Okay, so, but just because you have a liquidity shortfall, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the end. Could they not, for example, get refinancing or borrow, or is there no way of intervening, or at worst appeal to the government for a bailout? I mean, how many investment brokerage firms did that before? After the 2008 recession, they were bailed out. So why can't FTX similarly be bailed out?
Seek a bailout.
Yeah.
I think the fact that there was a particular idea of fraud in the process where it was discovered along the due diligence became problematic. That became immediately a legal problem. I think it's a great yes. And that being the case, I think he was, because immediately he was removed as the CEO. A new one was appointed. Which is interesting. The guy who took over Enron. Enron
of all companies,
yes,
is now he became the new CEO.
He's new CEO to run through the bankruptcy proceedings.
Okay, now if there's an element of fraud, one would assume there's some sort of criminal, potential criminal investigation.
Yes.
Is this happening?
Yes, that's what they've started. All the regulatory agencies and criminal agencies and what in the US are all in the case.
And do they know where this young man is, or is he on the run?
He's in the Bahamas, and they seem to indicate he has talked to the police there, but no one has seen him for that matter. So he initially denied, but bottom line, he's offshore in the Bahamas. And when you're in the Bahamas, registration of companies Bahamas and those other fancy areas always indicate an interesting story.
I wonder if they have an extradition treaty, and if not, maybe they might fail to pull him out.
That's very true.
But he apparently did try to cover his tracks by attempting to curry favor with powerful political forces. As it turns out, he was a major donor to Biden and the Democrats.
He has donated a great deal.
And obviously, one would assume, okay, One could ask, did he do so for ideological reasons? Does he believe in the causes Democrats support, or did he view the Democrats to be his potential allies in the event of any problems he may face down the road?
Yes, so far he's being lauded. Okay, the fact that his fraud is coming through is problematic. But initially, you can notice he had been lauded as a young, bright philosopher king. Such terms are being thrown around.
Did you watch that? There was that video. There was I forget his. I think it's called Nas Daily. There's a Asian guy who produces videos, mini documentaries for Facebook about interesting people. And so there's this video which now everyone is mocking, in which this young guy is being paraded like he's I don't know, he's like Bruce Wayne.
Or something.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Wow, what a quick turnaround. But so that's my question. Are there now concerns being raised as to the potential ethical conundrum, say, Democrats find themselves? Surely, if one of your biggest donors has been is being implicated in these sorts of crimes, to what extent could he have used those relationships to cover himself or to seek
curry favor with the political
right?
and regulatory?
Do you think that's a significant question to explore?
It could be a question, but one thing that you always have to notice, politicians are very good at running away from such problems.
Ultimately, how we did? No.
Ultimately, they will always find a way of distancing themselves. They will all, unless someone is holding donations that are not yet utilized, they often are pushed to either refund or something to or give to charity.
I've never heard of a politician refunding money.
No. Try charity or something of that nature.
Wow.
Yeah, particularly anything that they can directly link to an individual for if it becomes too hot.
Now, does this scandal only mean that, okay, does this scandal imply that, the aspect of cryptocurrency and crypto exchanges, like all this stuff, like it's now in dangerous waters, or is this just one bad example, but to not be lumped with all other players? Because now, as someone, and I don't know so much about crypto, but as I think about this story, I'm thinking to myself, wow, it seems so scary, it seems so dangerous, is it worth getting into? But then I remember in all other normal exchanges, there's the same kind of fraud and games. Real estate, there's games everywhere. So what would you say to someone who has now increased their skepticism, you being one of them?
Yeah, the idea that was behind cryptocurrencies initially, as a currency for that matter, is disappearing into the distance. It has become a world of speculation, favor and Ponzi schemes, and all the things that keep appear into view indicates that they are just like any other speculative bubble for that matter. And ultimately, people, especially small players, are bound to be burnt if they go in blindly. It's an interesting area for any billionaire to play in. I mean, if you're putting aside just 1% of your wealth, it's meaningless. Well, if you gain good, if you lose, well, it happens.
It's like going to the casino. Today you win, tomorrow you lose.
Yes, that's
no big deal.
Yes, true. The technology itself is fascinating, but it's still years away from being fully applicable and spreading around the world and playing the role that a lot of people hope it could. Most of the things are always very interesting, but when they become ideological in the approach rather than the technical detailing of how to put them together, it becomes problematic. So the idea that it was the new gold, that it was going to replace gold either as a hedge against inflation, that's dead in the water. Because if it was a hedge against inflation, inflation is rising and instead we find crypto falling. It would basically be stabilizing and going higher because it would be an escape route from inflation.
What do you say to those
within the economy?
What would you say to someone who thinks that there was deliberate sabotage? Of course, the big players weren't going to sit back and let a currency that they potentially couldn't control just run rife with the public. So there was a need to insert themselves in it, play around, and cause some havoc. Is that feasible?
It could, because what's interesting around that is that as more institutions come into an area, they have a very good chance of coordination in their activities.
Of course.
And if you notice, they were always very good at bidding up the prices, especially when they're holding. And a person like Elon Musk was doing it so deliberately.
Oh, yeah, he'd go into it.
Yes. He would say Dogecoin.
Yeah.
Well, he generated that one. Basically, that's his baby.
Yes.
Then he would say Dogecoin and people flooded in and put in money. Then he acquires a little. Then he plays around, then dumps it. He was holding a great deal of Bitcoin. He bid it up for a period of time. Then his and Tesla got rid of it with a lot of profitability on their part.
Yes.
So they would play. And then when you listen to him carefully talking about this, he says, no, I've never asked anyone to participate in this. And my holdings were so tiny of my portfolio. Just a side issue. So as a small player with your little squirreled away savings, well, if you can put a little, that's no problem.
Just to play with, no harm.
No harm.
But not to stake a whole chunk of your
livelihood.
Because I know that there are many people in Uganda who are investors in this crypto currencies, and there have been different programs, certain apps that have been launched in this market, encouraging people to invest in crypto. And so there's a lot of Ugandans, and for many Ugandans, especially corporate middle class, that already tried to play around with forex trading and commodities trading. So there's some people who kind of had a knack for this sort of thing and jumped on board.
Yes, that's very true.
What has been the impact of this controversy to the Ugandan cryptocurrency community? Because I think you might have mentioned that a lot of people have been losing out.
Yes, a lot of people have lost out.
Big time.
Yes, big time. People who had put in up to $50,000 and ultimately their valuation had climbed to 150 or more, and now are less than even 20, and they don't know what to do. They're in pain.
Can they sit it out? Is that possible?
No, some have lost it. They've sold the little that they are holding. They can't hold. I mean, it becomes a more of a existential problem.
Why? What if you just you hold your chips until it resurges?
No, you have to be very brave.
Really?
No, that would be very brave. And so I've noticed some that have gone in that direction. On the Ugandan scene, it's more about trading than the applicability of the technology itself.
Yes.
You can see the Blockchain Association is trying to come through. It has tried to put together a team, and they get to know each other for that matter. On the technology part, whether we'll have proper applicability that ultimately we enjoy the benefits of the technology itself, and especially, but that only comes if we allow our digital realm to be as open as possible, to be widespread as possible, and to be as cheap as possible.
Right.
Exactly. If we are not open to the particular area, we then generate problems that block out the participation of the rest of the population.
And it just remains the realm of the speculators,
exactly.
which is not a good thing.
Yes. And yet we have real serious problem within our bureaucracy, like land titles, that would really utilize such technology if well applied. If you had supply chain contract tracking, it will be very well utilized if they apply that kind of technology. But land titles in Uganda are a very, very, very important area that would really utilize such technology if it was well applied.
So the technology shows a lot of promise, I think. So the problem is in its practicability and implementation.
Yes, the speculative aspect. It's fascinating, of course. A lot of, if people are pouring in and they can make killings overnight, and like they did earlier, they would continue. Now it's at Bitcoin is at 16, and the rest of the whole area sector has basically been depressed. Because, and this is following especially the withdrawal of liquidity from the international market, which tells you they also follow the liquidity that has been supplied by the Federal Reserve and other banks.
And that's another thing, and I think it could be my final point, isn't this all tied into what we're experiencing now, which seems to be a global recession?
Yes.
And a constriction of global economy.
Yes. Basically, since the Western world decided that, okay, inflation is something they were going to tackle, they ultimately operate at a level of full employment. So any signs of inflation are something that they immediately have to deal with. And so it's understandable the increased interest rates that withdraws liquidity from the rest of the market across the world. But when that happens, a lot of the resources around the world flood into the US instead. And the rest of the other markets around the world suffer. Cryptos have suffered as well.
Yeah.
So they are following, which means they are an attachment, an appendage to the rest of the financial system, rather than a hedge against the rest of the financial system, as they hoped in the original white paper that there was designed to indicate that it will be an alternative. Instead, it has just launched on, too much money to play around with.
So
Everyone was willing to jump into the market.
So what do you think this says about the future of cryptocurrencies? Do you think there's going to be slower interest and a slower rate of onboarding people and investors?
What was important or what was promising about crypto was to stay out of the regulatory framework of the.
But now everyone's going to everyone is begging for regulation. That's why some people are saying this was a ploy to create this mess so that people beg you to govern them.
Yeah, and within the industry itself, I mean, there is a real plea for better regulatory frameworks under which they should operate, which tells you immediately the alternative, as an alternative, decentralized, independent, or otherwise,
failed.
It will not. But as an extra arm of speculation, without what people want to consider as an asset, it may not be an actual asset, but it's a wonderful speculative for the time being. So
wow.
That will
this
continue.
Is so fascinating, and I'm glad I invited you to explain it all to us. Now, are there any resources you could point people to who may be interested in learning more about this, the benefits and the risks? What recommended reading would you give?
Yeah. Around Bitcoin, it's always interesting to go to, there's podcasts.
Okay, podcasts.
Yes, podcasts have very interesting areas. There's one that is about the financial sector. It's, it escapes my head now.
Okay.
But I'll share it.
You'll
on
share
our
it with us
platforms.
later.
Yeah, I'll share it on our platforms.
That'll be great.
Yes.
Wow.
It gives a great deal of detail on the different areas of the financial sector, from inflation to and Bitcoin and this particular situation itself.
All right.
And so, yeah. It's
okay. Well, thank you so much, Wotsomu Wanda, financial consultant, for joining us today on the FATBOY Show. And I'd always been curious eager to speak to him on this, because since the beginning, I just saw him just saying bad things about crypto, at least voicing serious skepticism. And so I thought he'd be the perfect guy to ask about this. And yet you remain very objective in your assessment, and which is what I admire about you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again. Thanks for being with me today.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you're listening to the FATBOY Show. It's your number one station, RX Radio.